There's a strange sense of unease that comes with growing up in a world saturated by obligation. We're told implicitly and explicitly that we owe something to our family, our nation, our culture, even to ideas like morality, decency, or being a good person. Rarely, if ever, are we encouraged to ask, where do these obligations come from? And perhaps more dangerously, what if they're not real? Max Stirner, a 19th century German philosopher and radical individualist, argued that most of what we take for granted as sacred, be it moral norms, religious duties, or social expectations, are in fact nothing more than illusions. He called them spooks, abstract ideas that we allow to dominate our thinking and dictate our behavior. To Stirner, these spooks are not harmless ideals. They are ghosts we live for, suffer for, and in the end, die for, without ever asking if we wanted to in the first place. As Max Stirner says in The Ego and Its Own, the divine is God's affair, the human is man's. My affair is neither the divine nor the human, but solely what is mine. What Stirner proposes is not selfishness in the everyday sense. He is not advocating for cruelty or apathy, but for something more disorienting: radical self ownership. A way of living where the only obligations that bind you are those you freely choose, not those imposed by tradition, guilt, or authority. This position is unsettling precisely because it undermines the entire scaffolding of social life as we know it. But is that really a bad thing? There's a strange discomfort that runs beneath many of our relationships, obligations, and decisions. It's subtle, like background noise we forget is even there. But it shapes how we behave, what we choose, and how we value ourselves. That discomfort is guilt. Not the obvious kind that follows wrongdoing, but the deeper kind, the guilt of not being enough, the guilt of saying no, the guilt of choosing ourselves. We feel it when we refuse to answer a message, when we don't return a favor, when we quietly step away from traditions we no longer believe in. We feel guilty even when we're doing what feels right, as if we've broken a silent contract we never signed. But what if that guilt isn't natural? What if it's been planted in us by systems, by culture, by people who are themselves haunted by it? This is where the philosophy of Max Stirner becomes difficult to ignore. Stirner's philosophy is unsettling, not because it's radical, but because it's intimate. It doesn't begin with politics, theology, or even society. It begins with a quiet question: why do you do what you do? Stirner says we live under illusions, or what he calls spooks. These are abstract ideas that we internalize and obey as if they were real, even though they have no physical existence. They are social constructs, ideals, moral expectations, things like duty, truth, humanity, God, or even goodness. For Stirner, these ideas are not simply false, they are oppressive. They claim authority over our lives, but offer nothing tangible in return. They demand sacrifice, loyalty, and obedience, but they do not bleed, they do not suffer, and they do not love us back. As he says, They're no longer your ideas. You are theirs. What Stirner offers is not chaos or selfishness, but clarity. He invites us to strip away these inherited obligations and ask, in the most sincere way, what is mine and what do I truly want? To Stirner, real freedom isn't the freedom to vote or to speak or to worship. Real freedom is the freedom from ghosts, from the invisible masters we serve without question. This kind of freedom is deeply psychological. It requires us to confront every should that we've accepted as natural and examine its origins. For instance, the idea that we owe our parents simply for being born, that we must fulfill roles like dutiful son or loyal daughter, regardless of our own needs, or the idea that we must suffer silently for our communities, our countries, or some vision of moral goodness we inherited but never chose. These are not truths, they are traditions, and traditions, Stirner reminds us, are only sacred when they serve the individual, not when they devour them. This isn't a rejection of kindness or loyalty, it's a rejection of unconscious obedience. You can still love your family, still support others, still care deeply, but you must choose it, not be bound to it by guilt or fear. Stirner wasn't alone in this line of thought. Nietzsche, decades later, would describe something similar in his concept of slave morality. The idea that morality was not an absolute standard, but a tool used by the weak to control the strong. Or, as Nietzsche says, morality is the herd instinct in the individual. To Nietzsche, most people don't live ethically, they live obediently. They mistake fear for virtue. They call their submission humility and their resentment justice. And then there's Freud, who identified the eternalization of authority as the superego, the voice in our heads that punishes us for imagined failures, often inherited from our parents and early society. These thinkers didn't know Stirner personally, but they followed the same trail. The enemy is not always outside. Sometimes the tyrant is already inside us, and it sounds a lot like our conscious. But if we drop the illusions, if we stop pretending we owe anything to society, to religion, to morality, what are we left with? Jean Paul Sartre would say, we're left with freedom, and that's terrifying. As he says, man is condemned to be free because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. Without the scaffolding of divine command or cultural duty, we are forced to take responsibility for our choices. There is no map, no objective meaning, just the uncomfortable, infinite task of becoming ourselves. This is not easy. It's far easier to say, I must do this because it's right, than to say, I choose to do this and I accept the consequences. But Stirner would argue, anything less than that is not living, it's role playing. There is a common fear that if we reject all duty, we become cold and selfish, but that fear itself is part of the conditioning. Stirner's egoist is not a sociopath. He is a person who gives freely, but only from fullness, never from guilt. To give because you want to, because it brings you joy or meaning, is beautiful. To give because you must, because otherwise you are bad, ungrateful, or selfish, is emotional extortion. True kindness, Stirner suggests, must be free of debt. In this sense, his philosophy isn't about isolation, but about honesty, about relating to others as individuals, not as roles or duties. Friendship, love, solidarity. All of these remain possible, even stronger when they are chosen without pressure. lived without spooks is not loud or rebellious. It is quiet, it is personal, it is radical in a way that leaves no visible trace, except perhaps a strange sense of peace. You begin to say no, you begin to set boundaries, you begin to act from desire, not guilt. And eventually you realize you don't owe anyone your silence, your time, your energy, or your suffering, not even your past self. This is not selfishness. You are not here to be good. You are not here to be useful. You are not here to satisfy the expectations of ghosts. You are here briefly, unpredictably, and your life is your own. Or as Stirner says, I am owner of my might, and I am so when I know myself as unique. Perhaps the beginning of freedom is not found in protest or philosophy, but in a simple realization. The realization that you don't owe anyone anything, and that is where your real life begins.